with you here today. Maybe I'll just start with a little bit of an anecdote. So last November, my friend flew from Manhattan to New Mexico to visit with her family. She hadn't been home to see her parents in almost 2 years, and as luck would have it, her brother was able to time a visit home at the same time, bringing with him his wife and children. As you can imagine, this quickly became cause for celebration, and soon, local family, aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, hatched a plan to all gather at her parents' house for a Sunday lunch. So, good news went to better news when it turns out her mom was able to also get a bushel of mild hatch chilies. In November, that's very late in the season. So for those of you that may not appreciate or understand the cultural significance of the hatch chili, I know we have someone here from El Paso, which is where I'm from, and maybe those from New Mexico, but the hatch chili is ubiquitous in New Mexico and West Texas. And if you've ever ordered enchiladas, you've probably been asked, green or red? The hatch chili is what makes the green sauce green. And by the way, it's malpractice to do a tech talk in 2024 and not include artificial intelligence in some way. So the way that we're doing that today is by using mid-journey generated AI images to illustrate some of the points that I'm making here. So if you look very carefully at the 4 images on the board, you will see that there's not a single hatch chili in any of the images, notwithstanding that being one of the prompts. So some of these images are better than others, and you'll see what I mean as we make our way through the presentation. But anyway, the way that you prepare hatch chilies is by roasting them. And as with roasting anything, it involves a lot of heat. But when you roast chilies, you also throw a lot of capsaicin into the air. So as you can imagine, this is a labor of patience and love. And that responsibility fell to my friend's dad. He spent a good chunk of the afternoon sequestered by the grill, pink, misty, coughing. And then a few hours later, at dinner, she noticed that he was tugging at his collar intermittently. And soon, she noticed that he was rubbing his arm. And it wasn't long before the family realized that he was deep in cardiac distress. My friend and her brother followed behind the ambulance as they carried her father to the local ER. They were surprised to see, however, that the ambulance passed the turn that would have taken them to the nearest hospital. My friend and her brother followed behind for nearly 20 more minutes until they arrived at a hospital in a neighboring town. So if you haven't figured out what's going on by now, her local hospital was recovering from a ransomware attack, and they were diverting new patients because they were unable to operate at maximum capacity. For those of you that have a loved one that has experienced a heart issue, or perhaps you yourself have heart issues, you know that minutes are precious, and they can mean the difference between a full recovery or anything but. And I won't leave you in suspense. My friend's father did survive, but he continues to rehab cognitive and occupational issues to this day. And just a couple of weeks ago, in talking to her, she confessed to me that not a week goes by that she doesn't wonder if that 20 minutes adversely affected her father's recovery. The consequences of digital security affect all of our lives in direct and indirect ways. Everything we do has a digital touch point today. My hope at the end of this hour with you is to convey to you both the complexity and the urgency of this problem. Unlike a lot of complex problems, we actually have a really good sense of what we need to do to become more secure as a society. But like a lot of public policy problems, we simply have not decided who will bear the burden of the cost of implementing those measures. I'll ask you also to suspend the economic lens through which you typically view the world and keep an open mind as we have this conversation today and hopefully into the future. So if you're someone who typically prefers to let the market govern itself, or whether you're someone who typically prefers regulation. This is my favorite image, by the way. So America is an undeniable superpower. But this wasn't always the case. A number of factors led to our ascent: economic strength from global trade, technological innovation, cultural influence, and of course, military power. Arguably, military force projection and our exceptional ability to sustain our military during conflict has given us an outsized role in the world today. We can defend our interests far beyond our borders. So if someone is threatening peaceful passage in the Strait of Hormuz, we'll DoorDash our Navy to their door. That ability to be everywhere and all at once is exceptionally powerful, and it's a tool that we nearly exclusively enjoyed for decades. Now, what I want you to consider is how digitization is leveling the playing field. It's leveling the playing field for our competitors, and it's posing unacceptable risk to the homeland. Earlier this month, the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party held a public hearing in which, for the first time, the Department of Defense, the FBI, CISA, and the Office of National Cyber Director admitted that the government had identified and exfiltrated Chinese Communist Party-backed hackers. They were lying in wait in our critical infrastructure, waiting to execute the Chinese military doctrine of inducing societal panic. They were in our water, they were in our electric grid, they were in our transportation systems, and they were in our aviation sector. Think about that for a second, and think about the implications of that. Gone are the days when a geopolitical competitor would need to ship Marines or park an aircraft carrier outside of our borders to send a message. Today, any criminal or malicious nation state with even a modest level of technical proficiency can disrupt the infrastructure that provides our critical services. The point that I'm making here is that the playing field is more level than it's ever been. And unfortunately, through inaction, we have allowed that to happen. So this is an AI-driven image of a pipeline that explodes underwater. Just by virtue of illustration, some folks may not understand. People think about digital disruptions as like you can't get on your email or you don't have internet access. But today, a lot of our critical services, like the machinery that runs physical equipment, is connected to IT systems. So I can be sitting 100 miles away from this pipeline, and if I breach your IT infrastructure, I can jump over to your OT systems and maybe change the pressure in a pipeline and cause an explosion hundreds of miles away from where I sit. By the way, this is also, I can't tell if that's a mountain range behind this pipeline or if that's water, but this is another, it was a confusing image. This is also one of my favorites. So the prompt for this, I don't remember exactly, but it was like a meltdown at a power plant. And when it hits the fan, we send in the astronauts, I guess. I'm not really sure what's happening, but it's just, in case that's not part of your operational plans, you should really think about that. Okay, so why are we in this situation today? The truth is we're navigating three concurrent realities. The first is we have widespread digital vulnerabilities across our old and our new infrastructure. You can think of a vulnerability as an unlocked digital window or door that a criminal can access your system through. We have these vulnerabilities installed everywhere. We have them in our subway trains, our power plants, our pipelines, our bridges. At the same time, we're installing more unlocked digital windows and doors by the day. And partly that's because we're building more products and services as smart by default, but we're not necessarily building them as secure. So with each new smart thermostat or sensor or security system that you install to the internet, you're potentially adding another unlocked digital window and door. Second, the majority of the infrastructure that provides us with our critical services is owned and operated by the private sector. And it's each of those private sector entities that make their own cybersecurity and risk tolerance decisions. But the consequences of those private decisions are borne by a much broader pool of victims when there's a breach. A great example of that, for those of you that were on the East Coast, was Colonial Pipeline. The pipeline went down. States and federal governments had to come together to mitigate the damage, to include making sure we could get fuel to airports and gas stations, among other things. And last, a little bit of an epiphany of the obvious, but criminals and malicious states know that digital crime is profitable, right? So they extract ransoms, they steal trade secrets, and malicious states leverage digital intrusions to advance their geopolitical aims. So how do we change, I think, is the real question. There's some good news here. The administration and Congress, and I think broadly society, has begun to recognize more aggressively over the last few years that status quo is just unsustainable. Evidence of that is the number of legislative policy and regulatory measures that we've seen spit out over the last 3 to 4 years. But objectively, I think the evidence, the results show that we've still not done enough. The administration has published a roadmap towards security in the form of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, but even that roadmap recognizes that we have to fundamentally change how we navigate this issue. It also recognizes that some of the measures that we need to become more secure require congressional action. I think the lesson to take today is there's a gap between our good intentions and our willingness to roll up our sleeves and do the hard work. Okay, so what can we really do? What are the actual actions? The good news is, as I told you before, this is a complex problem, but actually a lot about the solutions are quite known, and a lot of these solutions that I'm going to share with you today have been discussed in the public for years. And I want to emphasize that none of these are my organization's ideas. These are organizations that are in the public discourse that you can look up and study a bit later if you're interested. But as we think about how to fix it, fundamentally, our insecurity is a consequence of our underlying vulnerability, which is as a result of these things. So I would point you back to this framework. And let's think about the 3 realities. Let's start with what measures we can take to address the widespread vulnerabilities. And let's start with our software. So today, software developers prioritize speed over security. What that means is software that's sent to the market sometimes is sent with known vulnerabilities. Manufacturers disclaim themselves of any liability through user terms and conditions. So in practice, the manufacturer is shifting the security burden to the consumer that is probably not very well equipped to deal with it. And the consumer, some of us, are installing this same software into some of our nation's most critical infrastructure. That market dynamic is inconsistent with the goal of raising our security practices. So to address this, many have argued that we need a software liability regime to shift the liability back to the software manufacturers. And a software liability regime, you hear the word liability and it's triggering, right? But a liability regime need not necessarily be adversarial. And I want to emphasize that perfect software isn't the goal. It's actually, nor should it be, it's not really possible, frankly, for those of you that are software developers know exactly what I'm talking about. But the goal of a software liability regime is to impose a burden of care, a duty of care on manufacturers. And the expectation would then be that these manufacturers just develop software using widely accepted software development norms and practices. So for those of you that I know there are a lot of CISA folks here, you have like the Secure by Design initiative, and there's a lot of work out there. These are known norms. Developers that then fail through negligence to meet those, to uphold that duty of care, could then potentially be liable. Some have really bristled against this idea, and those that are opponents of a liability regime will say, well, by shifting the burden back to the manufacturer, you jeopardize innovation. A reasonable argument to say that that view is faulty is that it fails to take into consideration the cost to innovation in today's model. The only difference is, in today's model, the costs of insecure software are borne downstream, not by the software manufacturers, but by the consumers. And we bear those costs in the form of breaches, reputational damage, and stolen trade secrets. So a second issue that we have when it comes to the number of vulnerabilities across our infrastructure is that the way that private tech companies take certain products to market is just inconsistent with our security goals. So for example, there are cloud service providers that may provide software, but cloud service providers that have one stream of revenue where they sell you their platform, access to their platform. And they have a second stream of revenue where they sell you security services to secure that platform. That's analogous to you going to Ford, buying a Mustang, and as you've agreed on the price, Ford's saying, all right, let's talk security. Do you want seatbelts? Do you want anti-lock brakes? Do you want airbags? Like, it's just inconsistent if you're a society that cares deeply about security. And what that practice means, by the way, is we have a number of critical infrastructure owners, operators, that buy these services with all good intention, and they buy them without security. So like immediately, I can't remember, there's like a movie where the line is like, immediately no. Like that's essentially where we find ourselves today. One last point on vulnerabilities. Early on, I observed that the number of vulnerabilities increases by the day, and that's because we sell more products and services as smart by default. I'm guilty of it. Anything that's smart, I get pretty excited, and I don't know why. My mother has a smart oven. I'm not sure why she needs that. We actually don't know how to use it, frankly, but she's got one. Maybe it's time we more carefully examine when a product needs to be smart. And I think a really great illustration of this, and I can't give credit to it, I can't remember who it was, but someone on my LinkedIn feed a few weeks ago had come across, it was actually a rambling rant, it was great. They came across a smart coat check. So for those of you that maybe are from warmer climates that haven't really experienced a coat check is a pretty straightforward exchange. I take my coat, I hand it to a human, the human gives me a tag that corresponds with the tag that's on my coat. I go to the opera, I go to the dinner, I come back, I hand that human my tag, they hand me my coat. So this smart coat check requires the person that wants to leave their coat with the attendant to download an app to their phone. You download the app to your phone, you enter all sorts of personally identifiable information. Maybe you connect your payment information, because typically when you pick up your coat, you also offer a tip. And then you still go to the human, hand that human your coat, only this time, in lieu of the ticket, you have your app. End of the night, you come back, you show the attendant your app, you get your coat, and maybe you tip the attendant using your app. So what that means in practice is we have yet another repository of personally identifiable information, likely with possibly not the best security practices, right? This isn't a bank, this is a coat check that is just there waiting for someone to hack and exfiltrate the data and use for nefarious purposes. And do we really need that? Like, do we really need, some of these products, do we really need to make them smart? Because once you make something smart, you then have to manage it, right? So my organization, we have a ton of data on the relationship between an organization's security posture and their likelihood to experience a breach. And some of the first things that we tell entities is that they should manage their attack surface, so like manage the number of digital windows and doors, locked or not. And the second thing we tell them is they should have a system for patching vulnerabilities or critical vulnerabilities as they come out. So the more smart you build, the more work that team of people has to do. The second reality that we're navigating is that the majority of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. I want to tell you that that's an excellent model for so many reasons. I'm not advocating anything different. But the issue today is that those individual companies are deciding what good security practices look like. And all evidence, given the number of breaches, is that those private decisions don't really align with the security priorities of the public. So a couple of proposals have been made to navigate this particular issue. One is actually quite old. So the first is to have sector-specific cybersecurity performance standards. We'll just call them standards. It's actually quite a simple concept. Congress actually considered these in 2011 and 2012. They considered standards but failed to establish them. They were thinking about them for our critical infrastructure. There was a lot of arm-waving about how standards would be problematic, and those that opposed standards said that we can just defer to the market to make the right decisions, and let's see how that rolls. Well, it's been over a decade, and some would suggest that a decade of lived experience would say as evidence to the contrary that we are where we need to be in terms of our security. So standards are necessary because, again, today we have each individual entity that's deciding what good security looks like in practice. That's why we see security practices are haphazard and they're insufficient. So what standards would really do, as the name suggests, is that they would establish a minimum sector-wide floor. And the truth is, most businesses would voluntarily exceed these, because many businesses, especially larger businesses, are actually making significant investments. Where we have vulnerabilities are some of the smaller businesses that are actually, we have vulnerabilities everywhere, but some of the smaller entities may be navigating without massive security teams that can guide them, and they may be falling below some baseline level standard. So a standard is literally the least a company could do. And there's actually quite a bit of work that's been done on what we call them sector performance goals, because they're not required, but CISA in March put out some guidance on what this could look like. So if you're at a state and you're thinking about this for home, I recommend that you go to the CISA website and pull those. Another controversial view in the context of the challenges associated with individualized decisions and the majority of our infrastructure being owned and operated by private entities is some are asking if certain sectors are just too important to defer security decisions to the owners and operators of those sectors. This can sound incredibly self-serving as someone who comes from a tech firm, but just bear with me for a second. This comes up in different ways. So some have said, like, should those businesses be required to outsource certain aspects of their security? And they could either outsource them to like private entities, or some have advocated that for the defense industrial base, some small businesses, their only consumer is the DoD. Like maybe the DoD then should be securing those consumers if what those entities, if what they're developing is critical. If you think about it, we have, again, a ton of data that shows good security really is not about a silver bullet product that you put into place or technology. It's much more about a consistent practice, because we're constantly modifying your attack surface, you're installing new equipment, people make mistakes, and some businesses are just, they're too small. They may not have, I mean, even if they had the budget, they couldn't find, in some cases, the right expertise, because we have hundreds of thousands of unfilled cybersecurity jobs in this country. And even if they could find the people, sometimes they might not be able to afford them. That risk may be acceptable for a small florist. But the way that water works in this country is we have a lot of small sort of volunteer cooperatives that are dealing with making sure that communities have potable water. So this is a little bit of an epiphany of the obvious here, but it's worth stating. We need to do more to tackle permissive jurisdictions and disrupt criminals' ability to benefit from the proceeds of crime. There's actually extensive work happening here. This has been a great week for this bucket, actually. There are active negotiations on a UN agreement on cybercrime. There are ongoing discussions about digital norms. There are also multilateral organizations and alliances of entities that are working to disrupt criminal activity. When I said this has been a big week, for those of you that are in this space, you might have seen that the US, UK, I think it's 11 global partners got together and took down Lockbit, the Lockbit site, which is a ransomware as a service, prolific. I saw a CNN article describing them as a menace, which is like a great word. And that happened just this week. That's pretty big. But it's a little bit like you're playing whack-a-mole, right? Because like these groups, you take them down, they reconstitute, and they operate under another name. One of the policies that comes up here is how do we, not only how do we deal with permissive jurisdictions, so a lot of these criminals, not malicious nation state actors, let's just deal with criminals for a moment. They're operating in permissive jurisdictions. A lot are in Russia. There's no immediate path to working to make those jurisdictions more hostile to some of those criminals. They may, in fact, some would argue, be achieving, their incentives may be aligned with the government's. One policy that comes up here, though, is this act of paying ransoms, right? So ransomware in particular is, in business email compromise and fraudulent transfer of funds, all of these things are profit motivated. So one of the policy discussions that comes up often is, should we, as a country, ban a victim's ability to pay ransoms? You've probably heard this debate come up in kidnapping and things before, if you're not familiar with this space. On this is a really complicated issue. I will just observe that I don't think you can take any of these options off the table, but sequence is important. So today, we have consumers that are essentially inheriting faulty tech equipment and having to figure out how to navigate that. And by imposing another burden on them to potentially not be able to pay a ransom, that's sort of another measure where you're just like pushing the consequences of insecurity on victims. That's one argument. A second, more practical argument in terms of how this might work in practice is, when it comes to policy, there are rarely, if ever, bans. you're always going to have an exception to a ban. We see this with sanctions, for example. You can get a license to do something that may otherwise be prohibited under sanctions. So in practice, what that might look like if you had a ban, you may find yourself in a situation where you're providing exceptions to that ban. In the case of, for example, a hospital where there's an exigent circumstance, lives potentially are on the line, there may be a calculation that payment of a ban is, in that case, acceptable for policy and other reasons. In time, these criminal actors will notice that pattern. We know, and the intelligence community and the private sector intelligence community understands that these actors talk to one another. And so what that policy may do is actually, ironically, direct the criminals towards the very infrastructure that you're trying to protect with a ban. Then they'll only go after where they think they could get payment exceptions. Arguments that are, proponents that are of a ban say, well, at the end of the day, this is a financially driven business, and if we remove the profit from the business, we may be able to shape bad actor behavior. So what I framed for you are just a number of many of the policy issues that you see in the public discourse. These are by no means exhaustive. There are many more. I think what's clear, it's horrifying, isn't it? Digital security, I hope you agree, is an urgent issue, and we have to do more. The reality is, it's really easy to talk about this as an interesting policy issue, but during a conflict, our digital insecurities could really become existential risks. I'm from an area of the United States that gets a lot of hurricanes, and we sometimes would lose power for a week on end. Now imagine that for weeks at a time. We were just discussing that in the back of the room. Add in no potable water for weeks at a time. Watch it happen in multiple regions in the United States at once. Disrupt transportation. We have just a handful of companies that deal with transporting and packaging food in this country. JBS Foods is an organization that was also hit by a ransomware incident in 2021. You can see how these issues, they're not hypothetical. The risks are real. We now have the government saying that they've identified, not just criminals, but they've identified CCP-backed hackers, and that's in a hearing about CCP, competition with CCP. So the reason that I'm here, and I really hope what you take away from this today, and I mean this, I've worked in a lot of, you've heard Dr. Brown talk about the many places that I've worked. This is an issue that I actually really feel like it is a massive threat to us. And by virtue of your role as bureaucrats, as consumers, as citizens, as teachers, every one of you is in a position to educate others about this issue, and every one of you is in a position to demand that we do more to solve it. And I don't think we're gonna get there until and unless more people are talking about this as a priority. And hopefully you don't have to wait until someone that you love is diverted from a local hospital to do it. So I'm always around. Feel free to reach out to me if you need anything. I'm happy to arm you with talking points. I'm in a data-driven business. We have a ton of data. I'm happy to do whatever I can to point you in the right direction. And I mean it, I wouldn't offer it if it weren't the case.